Anchors of War, Chapter 2. January 24, 2904 Landing City. Independent colony of Hannah's world. The world was made of blood and fire. At least, that's what it seemed like to Matthew. On the screens, he saw man-shaped things pour from shuttles and drop pods, firing as they went. They were orange, and they seemed to have one less finger than they should, but they seemed almost like humans. Except for the strange language they were shouting in and the very advanced particle beams they were shooting at people. The stubborn few who had yet to evacuate their homes tried to run away from them, but they were instead gunned down in the street. Some turned back to fight, and a few of the aliens fell in sprays of blood, but there were just too many. It didn't seem like the aliens had brought any ground vehicles, but that was small comfort. The few militia in Matthew's guard post still probably wouldn't last more than a few days at most against the numbers and training of the enemy. Checking the screens again, he saw that the aliens were nearing his bunker. The door began to glow with heat as dozens of handheld particle weapons fired on it in unison. It would take them a few minutes to cut through. He steadied his grandfather's assault rifle against the concrete barrier in front of him and aimed it at the large blast doors that the enemy would have to enter through. The other militia were doing the same, not speaking. He vowed to kill at least a few of the orange bastards before they got him. When the door finally melted, he started firing single shots at the hole. He was rewarded with a cry of pain, and what was probably cursing in some alien language. After this, a few aliens cautiously peeked around the hole they had made, protected from the heat by some kind of energy shield. From what he'd seen, those shields couldn't handle kinetic weapons very well at all, which was a blessing. A few of the militia took part shots at the aliens and got a couple hits. "Take that motherfucker," yelled one militiaman as he raised his fist, only to have his hand cleaved off completely by a particle beam. He screamed, cradling the now cauterized wound and dropping his weapon. The militiamen continued firing at the door and occasionally getting hits. Rarely, the aliens would also get one, sending a militiaman back to the bunker's infirmary to be fitted with an emergency combat prosthetic and sent back to fight. Emergency combat prosthetics were not as good as regular limbs, and not nearly as good as a cybernetic one, but they were better than no limb and were meant for those times when people had to be rushed back to the front immediately. They were also extremely painful to put on, as evidenced by the screams coming from the infirmary. Several hours later, the alien troops stopped attacking for a moment, which gave Matthew and the remaining militiamen a chance to rest, eat, and check the screens. Walking over to the nearby guard post, he looked inside. The equipment seemed fine at first glance. The first thing he did was check the status lights that indicated other bunkers. Half a dozen of the 30-odd lights were red, indicating that they were completely overrun. It was likely those bunkers had never fully closed before the aliens had arrived. All of the remainder were yellow, which meant that they had been breached and were under attack. None of the status lights were green at the moment. He walked up to the chair next to the communications console, put on the headset there, and began searching through the communications links between bunkers. The first channel yielded only a depressing silence. The second had the sounds of magnetic railguns, like his own weapon firing on full automatic. The third had the telltale sound of particle weapon fire, meaning that most of the guard posts were overrun. Those three tells were repeated through all of the channels. Nobody was calling for help, at least not from the other bunkers, he sighed, taking off the headset. It could have been worse. He just hoped that his parents and his students were all right and would stay that way. Year 509,684, Month 5, Day 23 Galactic Standard Time, aboard Disecri Dominion Superdreadnought Everlasting Bloodlust. Sec Vri pounded the arm of his chair in frustration. This should have been easy. Their actual casualties were 5 times the projected amount. He had already lost thousands of troops, and mostly 2 small groups of enemies. They must be some kind of elite soldiers. That was the only logical explanation. Not only that, but even with those losses, his men had failed to take most of the bunkers. Quikree was not pleased. In fact, he was livid. He had stopped, looking over Sec Vri's shoulder, only because he could barely resist the urge to start punching things. The only options left to Sec Vri were bombardment, waves of men, or sending in his elite troops. Bombardment would be the worst option. The Dominion wasn't going to pay to send citizens all the way out here. so having no people would make the colony worthless. Wave attacks were only slightly better, but those were barbaric, and he could very well be relieved of his command if he wasted lives that way. So, his only real option was to deploy his elites. He knew that they, at least, would get the job done. After all, his son was one. Sisian Desimbu was excited. His father was allowing him to prove himself and his men. He was finally being deployed into the combat here. Had it been his choice, he and his men would have been in the first landing, not the last one. It seemed like that would probably have saved many Desek lives. Judging from the losses the regulars were taking trying to capture the remaining holdouts. Even now, after so many Desek attacks, many defenders remained. They had been whittled down, sure, but there would be plenty to ensure that there was glorious and honorable combat. This was going to be fun. The 3rd of February 2904 Landing City, independent colony of Hannah's World. Matthew was exhausted. He had been fighting for nearly 10 days now. There were only 5 other militiamen left alive to guard the entrance. They were all low on ammunition and sleep. The only things they had in abundance were food and water, but they didn't have much time to eat or drink. Like clockwork, the aliens would attack every few hours, probably rotating in fresh soldiers from their reserves. Over the past 3 days, all but 5 of the little status lights in the guard post had gone red, usually 1 or 2 for every attack. Matthew knew this was the end. The next attack would finish them, and then they would take the people that Matthew was trying to protect. He knew the bunker his parents had been in had already fallen, as had that of most of his co-workers and students. It was likely that many were dead. He don't want that to happen to this bunker, but he likely don't really have much of a say in it. "Here they come," yelled the man next to him, waving his temporary prosthetic arm. Matthew snapped out of his thoughts and once again readied his rifle. This time, he attached a combat knife, energy variant to it. He had picked it up off of the military guy that he went down, and it seemed like it might see use today. Up ahead, he saw movement, but it wasn't like the previous attacks. The aliens seemed bigger. It was possible they had finally decided to break out some kind of heavy armor to dislodge the defenders. He wasn't surprised that something like that had happened. He was more surprised it hadn't happened sooner. Maybe they were expensive or something. Whatever the reason, there were now better alien troops attacking them, when regulars could have broken their defenses just fine. Their valiant defense was almost certainly about to end. Matthew tensed, waiting for the strike to come. One of the militiamen peeked his head over the barrier, only to have a particle beam go straight through his eye and cook his brain. One of the other militia took a few part shots at the door, but it don't seem like he had hit anything. The attackers were once again silent. Then, 6 of the aliens in hulking suits suddenly burst through the doorway, firing at the barriers as they ran. All of the militiamen opened up with everything they had, with railguns spraying on full automatic and shotguns hitting the suits with slugs. 2 of the big suits fell over, but in return, they took out 2 of the remaining 4 other militiamen. Now, it was just Matthew and 2 other men. Matthew stopped firing for a moment and traded a look with his last allies. This is the end. He gestured at the hulking men in suits, who were now slowly making their way over to the barricades, thinking the defenders dead. He then gestured at his combat knife. The other 2 men nodded solemnly. Matthew held up first 3 fingers, then 2, and finally 1. Then, he and the other 2 men burst from cover, yelling and firing their weapons. 2 of the hulking suits took hits, falling. Behind Matthew he heard a scream, which cut off halfway as the particle beams found one of his comrades. His other ally managed to take out one of the last 2 suits before going down to a perfect eye shot. Then, it was Matthew's turn to go one-on-one with the last guy in a suit. Matthew pressed down on his SA-77's trigger, only to get a hollow click. Swearing, he ran towards the last alien, brandishing his combat knife and yelling his defiance. The alien looked at him and then drew a knife similar to Matthew's own. Matthew put his weight behind a desperate strike at the alien's chest, only to be blocked by the alien's knife. He hadn't trained for this, damn it. He knew how to shoot, not how to win a knife fight. Matthew lunged toward the alien again, only to be blocked again. Suddenly, the alien lunged towards him, aiming for his chest. Matthew managed to jump to the side slightly, and caught the combat knife in the shoulder instead. where it cut straight through several muscles, set fire to his shirt, and cauterized the wound. Screaming in pain, Matthew desperately thrusted his knife at the alien's helmet, but the alien blocked it. The alien's helmet speakers began making a noise. ... was it? Was it fucking laughing? Enraged, Matthew charged the alien one last time, at first lunging for the abdomen, but switching at the last second to the helmet. Surprised and overconfident, the alien reacted too slowly. His knife went straight through the place where the alien's eye should be, and then went further. The alien's knife went into Matthew's stomach, setting fire to his shirt and cutting straight through him. Shuddering, the alien fell, pulling the knife out of the cauterized wound. Matthew screamed in pain one last time, and then fell backwards onto the concrete floor, and then everything went black. The 3rd of February 2904, Sol Confederation Navy ship Mars, Hannah Star. Dropping anchor in 3, 2, 1. Anchor dropped. "Welcome to Hannah Star," said the engineering lieutenant on the bridge. "Thank you, Lieutenant," said Captain Forrester, nodding. "What's the situation here?" "It looks like the enemy fleet composition has not changed. 5 super dreadnoughts, 10 dreadnoughts, 20 battleships, -1 battle cruisers, 60 assorted heavy and light cruisers, 100 destroyers, and around 300 frigates and corvettes. We outnumber them slightly in capital ships, but they outnumber us in escorts. Also, the ships have on average more tonnage and size than one of ours of the same class," replied the sensor officer, nodding. Hackett looked at the holotable in the Fleet Command Center on Mars. This would be a tough fight, but he was sure they could win it. Hackett to Severus Sector Fleet, enter formation Chevron 3 and begin accelerating towards the hostile fleet.